Hello, welcome to Baltic World, the premier channel discussing news and important issues facing Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Crispin and I've got a critically important story for you today. It turns out that Russia's military buildup in its western frontier appears to have continued unabated. Not only that, the CIA seems to assess that the final purpose of this is to invade eastern Ukraine in a spring offensive. Now, how did we get to this? Well, I've got a report here that kind of discusses the CIA assessment, but right now there is a major conference underway in Riga, Latvia, a NATO meeting. A lot is dripping out of that right now, so we will go into some of those details and discuss the issue at length. But to kick us off, there is this opinion piece in the Washington Post by David Ignatius. It's titled, "Why the CIA is so worried about Russia and Ukraine." The CIA discovered something scary in October. Russia was moving troops toward the Ukrainian border, and unlike in previous border thrusts, was making secret plans about how to use them. The agency also worried that the potential conflict zone didn't appear to be just the eastern sliver of Ukraine occupied by Russian-backed separatists, which Russian troops had approached the previous April, but a much broader swathe of the country. Alarm bells rang at the agency and then across the US government. Reports of the Russian buildup couldn't have come at a worse time, blah, blah, blah. The tension mounted through November. CIA Director William J. Burns rushed to Moscow at the beginning of the month to warn the Russians that an invasion of Ukraine would shatter the Russian economy and void any hope of rapprochement with the West. But Putin didn't seem to be listening. The Russian buildup continued, accompanied by defiant rhetoric. As the Ukrainian crisis enters December, the Biden administration is pursuing what policymakers like to call a, quote, dual strategy. To deter a Russian invasion, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will meet Wednesday with NATO allies in Latvia to share US intelligence and discuss joint military plans to raise the cost of any Russian invasion. At the same time, the White House has continued high-level conversations with Moscow that could lead to a meeting between Biden and Putin, virtual or in person, before year's end. Now, we'll leave that there, but before we move on fully, there is a series of tweets from a Mikhail Baranowski. He is an expert on Poland-US relations. He's a director and senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And he says this, and I'm going to quote it out in its entirety. It says, "Few observations from Riga after talking with several senior officials from across the alliance at the NATO foreign minister meeting. The scale of Russian military buildup is unprecedented. This is not a repeat of the spring buildup. The talk of war in Ukraine is in the air. Russia's ultimate intentions are not clear, but the scale and capabilities that are being prepared would allow it to strike Ukraine from 3 directions, perhaps including through the north from Belarus. The broader strategic community, including think tanks for the moment, deeply underestimates the severity of the situation due to the classification of the specific information presented to the allies. That is, the CIA has its secret intelligence and it is sharing it at a high level with its European partners. In Riga, the alliance has built a common understanding of the operational picture in Ukraine and Belarus. Allies have put on the table a number of economic, political and military measures that can be deployed both bilaterally and by the alliance as a whole to deter Russia. NATO is determined to avoid the mistakes made in 2014 and to effectively deter Russia. This will require strengthening allies' presence also in the Baltic states and Poland." Now, I have no doubt that NATO countries as a whole will continue to build up its military presence in the Baltic countries and Poland, but Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Article 5 does not apply, and Russia has already been successful in biting pieces out of it, such as in Crimea. There is one more report I want to read out to you, and it is exceptional in its coverage. It's from Euronews, and it's titled, "Russian Military Buildup Near Ukraine is Unprovoked and Unexplained, Says NATO Chief." NATO foreign ministers on Tuesday called on Russia to de-escalate, warning they stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Speaking from Riga, Latvia, where NATO foreign ministers have gathered for a summit, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the buildup of Russian troops and military equipment near Ukrainian border is unprovoked and unexplained. Quote, "We see Russian military buildup, we see heavy armor, we see drones and combat-ready troops." Quote, "Russia needs to be transparent and they need to reduce tensions and de-escalate," he added. Serious consequences. Ahead of the NATO meeting, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Washington is very concerned about the movements we've seen along the Ukrainian border. "We know that Russia often combines those efforts with internal efforts to destabilize a country. That is part of the playbook and we're looking at it very closely. Any renewed aggression would trigger serious consequences," Blinken warned ahead of the talks in Riga, Latvia, with his counterparts in the 30-country military organization. The United States has shared intelligence with European allies, warning of a potential invasion of Ukraine. European diplomats acknowledged the Russian troop movements, but some countries have played down the threat of any imminent invasion ordered by Moscow. Obviously, that would be Germany. Now, Russia's red line, I'm skipping ahead here, but I think this is important because Vladimir Putin has talked about this in the last couple of days. He said on Tuesday, warned that NATO against deploying its troops and weapons to Ukraine, saying it represents a red line for Russia and would trigger a strong response. Commenting on Western concerns about Russia's alleged intention to invade Ukraine, he said that Moscow is equally worried about NATO drills near its borders. You can believe that if you want. Speaking to participants of an online investment forum, the Russian president said that NATO's eastward expansion has threatened Moscow's core security interest. He expressed concern that NATO could eventually use the Ukrainian territory to deploy missiles capable of reaching Russia's command centers in less than 5 minutes. Quote, "The emergence of such threats represents a red line for us." Now, before I move on, Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, gave another speech a couple of days ago, which I thought was even more interesting. He said that Russia has no inherent right to a sphere of influence. You cannot restore the Russian Empire to its former glory over the wishes and rights of sovereign nations, members of the European Union and NATO, and that includes also Ukraine. That Ukraine, if it wishes to join NATO, has every right to do so, and that the various NATO allies are working with the government of Ukraine to make that possible. Now, of course, if Ukraine joined NATO and the EU, then Russia would just find that absolutely intolerable. That's true for Belarus and certainly eastern Ukraine. Russia believes that it has absolute sovereignty over all native Russian speakers, be it in the Baltic countries, Belarus, or eastern Ukraine. And they have a deep sense of historical grievance over the eastward expansion of NATO, which they believed was agreed with Reagan and Gorbachev not to happen once Germany had joined NATO. And of course, it's now right up to the Russian border. So what's my personal assessment of the situation? Well, on the one hand, it is true that Russia lost 28 million people in the Second World War. They have a deep sense of vulnerability of possible invasion from the West. We saw, through the Baltic countries, through Belarus, the Wehrmacht. We saw the Napoleon go that way. We saw the Swedes go that way in the 18th century. And so, Russia does have a deep sense of vulnerability on its western frontier. However, NATO has always been a defensive alliance. And if you look at all of the archives, all of the literature, and I have done a lot of reading on the history of the Cold War, I can't find any indication ever that NATO was looking to invade Eastern Europe and threaten the Soviet Union. It was always about preventing the Soviet occupation of Western Europe and preserving the sovereignty and freedom of democracies in the West. Now, of course, NATO has since expanded eastward, but these countries have become democratic Western liberal nations, and the posture of NATO is still a defensive posture. There is no discussion about invading Russia and overthrowing the Putin regime or anything like that. It's purely about preventing Russian aggression into Eastern Europe. There is also a sense of Russian greatness in their own minds, that Russia is a great nation and deserves a sphere of influence, that the nations on its periphery really belong to Russia. And the reason why Putin is so supportive of Lukashenko is Lukashenko reflects that influence. I mean, they have a lot of serious problems personally between Putin and Lukashenko. I don't necessarily think they agree on everything, particularly when it comes to the border with Poland and Lithuania and the border crisis that's there. I think there are key differences between the two. You remember that Lukashenko, for example, threatened the supply of gas to Europe over howling Russian objections, and also locked down all Russian media outlets operating in Belarus, which Putin did not appreciate. So they do have differences. But one thing that Lukashenko and Putin agree on is that Russia deserves a sphere in its western periphery in Eastern Europe. Now, do I agree with that position? Of course not. I think that the Baltic countries have absolute right to self-determination. They are flourishing democracies. They have their own language and identity. They have just as much right to their territorial integrity as Russia does itself, as does Poland, as does all the entirety of Europe. That said, what does this mean for Ukraine? Well, I think that Putin is taking the threat that Ukraine is moving ever more into the Western sphere ever more seriously. I think he is dead serious about preventing that from happening. And if you think about the kind of annexation of Crimea that happened sort of 2013-14, well, he never really closed the deal. And this is sort of an embarrassment to his Chinese allies as well. I mean, he kind of made a big show of being the sort of geopolitical master able to redraw the map of Europe, talking about reclaiming territories that had previously belonged to Russia. And of course, Crimea has a very sizable Russian-speaking population. And yet the rest of the world has only accepted this in the most de facto way. Many sanctions remain. There is an absolute continuous restatement of resolution in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea. And there is currently, for Russia, no direct land connection between Russia and Crimea. That has to go through, territorial disputes in eastern Ukraine. And that territory still, on all maps, is Ukrainian. There is no way of just driving straight from Russia to Crimea without passing through contested Ukrainian territory. Vladimir Putin personally went and visited Crimea recently as part of major national celebrations, where he said that Crimea was an indispensable and inseparable part of the Russian Federation. So his personal commitment to maintaining a stranglehold on Crimea and a Russian presence in the Black Sea remains, I think, very strong. And then there is just the sheer military situation that is eastern Ukraine. It is very flat. The Dnieper River that runs right through Kiev, but kind of splits the country in half, is a formidable natural barrier. It's very hard to bring a lot of land power rapidly across the Dnieper into eastern Ukraine in a way that could prevent or match Russian aggression from the east. And also in that eastern region of Donetsk and so on, they all have major Russian-speaking majorities in those areas that are deeply sympathetic to the Russian Federation. I wouldn't necessarily resist a Russian invasion of that territory and opt to join Russia. Now, the final problem also is that unlike other countries that have sizable Russian minorities like Estonia, like Latvia, the economic situation in Ukraine isn't terribly good, particularly in the east. So Russia at the moment, of course, its per capita income is very low, but one of the things that deters people from separating from their own state is the economic affluence and prosperity that they have enjoying in their current situation. Well, at the moment, eastern Ukraine is not prosperous. People are doing very badly and are looking for significant change. And if that means joining the Russian Federation, well, that may not lift their economic circumstances over much, but they probably believe that it will, and therefore are more likely to accept foreign intervention. So you've got the geography, you've got the capability, you've got the intention, you've got the present kind of geopolitical situation where Crimea is separate from the rest of the Russian Federation, through Ukrainian territory. So it is almost certain that Putin's designs are to invade eastern Ukraine and take over that territory, create a direct connection between the Russian Federation and the Black Sea. And will that mean an invasion in the spring? Well, I don't know that. That's the bit that remains an unknown. It is certainly true that Vladimir Putin is looking for any pretext for why intervention is necessary, and he is openly threatening that if Ukraine moves further into the Western sphere, as Ukraine clearly is, that would be a red line for Vladimir Putin. We saw that under Donald Trump, there was increasing arms sales to Ukraine in order to fight separatist movements. That has continued under Joe Biden. So we're seeing an increased amount of support given to the Ukrainians militarily, and Putin is seeing that as a hostile act against Russia, or at least he's going to use that as a pretext for military intervention. So I would be taking this extraordinarily seriously. Russia probably is under the impression that the West won't intervene in a military sense should Russia invade eastern Ukraine. What's worse, they might actually be right about that. It would be extremely difficult to fight a conflict in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine not being part of NATO, and therefore probably not arousing significant opposition from many of the Western European countries. That would be critical. For example, we're not going to be seeing Germans on the ground in Ukraine fighting Russian troops. And whatever kind of sanctions or punishment that Putin is going to receive from the West as a consequence of any military intervention is likely, in their view, to be temporary. I mean, they've already built the vast majority of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. While it would certainly delay this coming online and the pumping of gas from Russia into Europe, it's probably not going to cancel it entirely. And in the meantime, they get to boast that they have redrawn the map of Europe once again and show the impotence of the West and NATO, also emboldening China in the East. If the United States is unable or unwilling to fight to defend Ukrainian territory, which I think is probably likely, then the Chinese, rightly or wrongly, may become emboldened over Taiwan and South China Sea as well. And if you look at the Chinese approach to sovereignty in the United Nations and other forums, they're all about maintaining national territorial integrity and preserving historical boundaries and all the rest of it, but it's all based on their perceived ethno-state, protecting the Han Chinese. Russia's rationale is very similar. They're doing this to, incorporate the native Russian speakers that exist in different parts of Europe under the sovereignty of Moscow. Now, will Vladimir Putin be successful in this? It remains to be seen. Will the United States find a way to deter Russia from invading Ukraine, find adequate punishments that Putin would find an intolerable cost? That remains to be seen as well. I am relatively confident, though, increasingly confident, that at present, Vladimir Putin is intending to invade eastern Ukraine in the spring with a major military incursion into Ukraine, possibly up to and including Kiev itself. It is unlikely that they will seek to take over all of Ukraine, but certainly all territory east of the Dnieper River. That's my view. What is your opinion, and what would you suggest be done to deter Russia and prevent this from happening, or to defeat it if it does? I'd be very interested in hearing your opinions. Also, if anyone out there is aware of the strategy that America is seeking to employ, please let me know in the comments down below. I will definitely report on that as more information becomes available. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Hit a like, subscribe, share this video, and see you next time. Goodbye.